to be here. There
we go.
Yes. Okay, there we go. Hi, my name is Sean Bloom.
And I'm Marcy Campos. And sorry, I jumped on your line there, Sean.
Nope, not at all.
The Interactive Media and Games Division in the University of Southern California, as everyone has said. And so Sean and I work together in the Game Innovation Lab. We also design games in our own free time together. We have a few games we've published together, and we teach classes at the university.
And today we're here to talk about storytelling in games. It's a big topic, and we're going to do our best to sort of cover the basics of it. It's my understanding that you have already gotten to see some lectures about sort of storytelling in general and how stories are structured, the flow, the arc of a story, what that looks like, how to tell a good story. So we're going to focus really on what is different when we're talking about games, right? What makes interactive media different from other kinds of media? And one of the questions that we have to pose to really start to dig into that is, who is telling the story in a game? In other media, the answer to this tends to be pretty clear. There's an author. Maybe it's a group of people who are working together to make a movie, but that group of people is sort of responsible for telling the story. For a play or a book, there is an author who has written the story. In a game, it's a little bit different because there's a designer who sort of came up with the ideas for what's in the world, what's in the game. But the player is the one who does the action and makes choices that determines what actually happens in the game, what sort of the outcome of events are. So in games, storytelling is more of a collaboration than in other media. It's a collaboration between the designer and the player, the designer who sort of crafts the game for the player to play in, and the player who actually plays it. What we're talking about here is the difference between passive and active engagement, right, on the part of an audience. And in traditional media like film, the audience has a passive role. They're watching the movie happen. For example, a movie will continue to play even to an empty theater. The viewer isn't required to participate in order for the story to be told. The movie is sort of just telling them what happens. In a game, it's different. A game won't play without somebody at the controller, somebody actually controlling it. The story doesn't move forward unless the player does.
So what we're talking about in terms of the author or the designer's content in a game is what we're going to be referring to as embedded narrative. So these are all the story elements that were explicitly decided upon the design team and embedded into the game experience. So these were all authored content, essentially. There we go. So it's actually, when we look at games and then we look at other media, embedded narrative seems very similar to a lot of traditional media. So basically, the script is the story and that's what happens. Everything that, it's designed just in similar ways, it's very, prescriptive. They want this, this happens. And so we're going to look at kind of we're going to do a little case study. We're going to look at some clips here, and we're going to look at very traditional versions of embedded media in games. So we're going to take a look at a cutscene, a scene with dialogue with player choices, non-player choice dialogue, and some descriptive text. And we're going to be looking at the game Dragon Age Inquisition, which is by BioWare, and I believe came out in 2015.
I think that's right.
Yeah, don't hold me to that. It was about 5 years ago. All right, so first we're going to start off with a cutscene. Oh, I'm going to pause it because we're going to need some sound.
Oh, I apologize. Let me... oh, can I fix that? Share sound. There we go.
Perfect.
Hopefully that will.
For a force to hold.
Nope, don't play it again. Nope, there we go. So in this cutscene, what was the story conveyed and how did the player learn it? And it's basically a movie. It looks like it could be a clip that was cut from Lord of the Rings. The dramatic swell of the music, the editing and shots, the low angle shot to highlight the Inquisitor as he passes the elf Solus by his side and discovers this new base for the game. It's this dramatic moment and it's framed that way. All of the elements are very traditional in terms of like film and television. We understand cuts, we understand edits, we understand the music, and even, you know, all the sweeps of the camera. It's all very, you know, traditional. We're now going to look at something that's more specific to games. So here's a scene where there is a discussion about what to do with a magical object, and the player character can actually respond in dialogue.
This is not a risk you can take. I have the best chance of making use of the well for everyone. Let me drink.
You're not concerned about the price? Bound forever to the will of Mythal?
Bound to the will of a dead god? It seems an empty warning. Perhaps a compulsion yet remains. Who can say otherwise? I do not fear it, even so.
What's to stop you from taking the knowledge and leaving?
My word. If that seems insufficient, Corypheus threatens all, even myself. He must be stopped.
And who stops you?
I, Inquisitor, seek neither immortality nor your life.
Thoughts?
She is right about only one thing. We should take the power which lies in that well.
I trust you with this power more than her. But it's not for me to decide.
You're asking me? This is a lot of weird... I barely understand how any of this works.
Enough deliberation. Give me your decision.
Looking at it, listening to it. That's not just knowledge from the ancient elven priests. It's their will.
How would you know such a thing?
That's what Abelas was telling us. The collective will of the priests puts anyone who drinks under a compulsion, a gas. Can't you feel it?
That would match the legends, but it does not tell us what the gas entails. I would still use the well, but you are right. We must be cautious.
If anyone is to use the well, it will be...
This is not a risk you...
Let's go back one. Sorry. There's a bit of delay on the slides. So this is a scene where the player can actually start to interrogate a scene. We see a lot of non-players characters doing what they do best, which is arguing points and explaining and actually giving exposition to the player about the choice that they're going to make and what's going on in the scene. So we see that through each of them, one arguing, let me drink from this dangerous well, and everyone else being like, I don't know if that's a good idea. But it allows the player the choice to investigate further or to go ahead and select on that little dialogue wheel a quick decision, and they don't actually have to spend the time. So they essentially get editing in terms of dialogue themselves, and they can investigate farther, or they can go ahead and just quickly make a choice. What I like about this scene a lot is that whatever traveling companions you have also voice their opinions, which gives you a bit of insight into the situation, but also into the characters that the player is playing with. And this scene, the consequences of the decision are not immediately revealed, but it kind of served to build tension into what are going to be the results of the choice I made. So it gives the player a bit of like, excitement to see what happens next, because they have responsibility for that choice. And we'll get into choices and how narrative can handle choices in a little bit, but we're going to keep going now with something a little bit more passive. This is party banter while you're playing, doing quests in the main game.
Griffins, but you're still not convinced.
Not convinced?
Yes, you know what I mean.
And you know this because?
I'm a people person.
I'm surprised you don't wear heavier armor on your blind side.
If I did that, I'd just be telling people where to hit me. As it is, every half-decent fighter sees the eye and thinks he can feint, then come in with a low stab. Then I chop his head off. It's like a gimme.
That can't work every time.
It doesn't, but taking a blade to the ribs is a pretty good teacher. So I hear you saved the last divine from a dragon assault.
Yes, in my youth, with help.
Nice.
You're not going to press for the details.
Nah, I can see you don't want to talk about it. Bet you look good doing it, though.
Convinced?
Yes.
I'm gonna not watch 2 hours of that. So let's.
Grey Wardens and honor.
There we go. So here's the Iron Bull. Here's the character that was doing most of the talking. He's voiced by Freddie Prinze Jr. He's excited to play the role. We can see heavily armored on one side, got an eye patch, and he talks about those things. And we actually get to get an understanding of a bit of his character. So in the very first bit of dialogue, we see him talking to somebody and saying, you don't believe the things that you talk about. And the character goes, I don't know what you're talking about. What makes you say that? And he goes, I'm a people person. This is actually great because not only does it tell us that Iron Bull's picking up on something from another player character that we don't know about, but not to spoil something in a 15 or a 5-year-old game, the character that he's confronting is actually lying about who he is. And so just by walking through and passively playing the game, we get insight onto both of these characters well before the scripted plot events happen later where that is revealed. We then can now reflect back that like Iron Bull saw it coming and knew that the character he was confronting, Blackwall, doesn't tell the truth. In the second bit of dialogue, we learn that he's a confident and an experienced fighter, and that he, takes into he also once again takes into how people read him into account into his fighting style. In the last bit where he's talking to the female character, Cassandra, we get a sense that not only is he aware of other people's feelings, he senses that she does not want to talk about this event where she saved someone from a dragon. But at the end, we also get a sense that he's a little bit of a flirt. So these type of passive dialogues that happen while you're out in the world can remark on either the surroundings, the other player characters, or future events that are about to happen. And much in the way like dialogue can hint to events going to happen in a film or a television scene. And the last bit of like what I would call embedded narrative, that is like, what we can immediately look and cite and be like, yes, this is scripted, this is narrative, I understand it, and I see this in a game, and it's, yeah, this is just like film, or this is just like a book, is actually just Words. Games love to put words in. So we'll find descriptive text, we'll find quest descriptions, we'll get letters in game or requests. This is a table mission, which is one of the elements of Dragon Age Inquisition, where you can just make a choice and resources are sent out and then you get the results of the choice you made. But there is actually you're not walking around with a player character, you're not actually fighting anything. So in this particular mission, one of your player characters asks for a favor, and you can kind of read that there, and then you get to choose essentially these 3 cards on the left, who's you're going to have settle this problem. So Liliana is proposing a solution of, this author has evaded the Merchants Guild, the crows might be a better choice for investigating him. All right, you make a choice. If we actually look at that text, in this particular bit of text, what we learn is a bit of the character Varric's backstory. It's loaded with references to previous games, and it gives us a bit of lore about the larger world, about places that maybe the player is not going to visit, but that are happening throughout. So in a game that is very expansive and world building like Dragon Age, which has a lot of calls to, fantasy, Lord of the Rings, you want to know all the lore and details of this world, and descriptive text does a really good job of doing that. But it is, I think, to kind of use not a derogatory term, but it's a lot of fluff. It's not important to the plot. It's not mission critical. You can ignore it, but by engaging with it, it enhances your knowledge of the world.
A lot of games actually include like whole books that you can stop and read. You can look in a library or something like that. All of these examples of embedded narrative that Marcy's talking about, these are all scripted moments. They all have this in common. They're authored by the designer ahead of time and presented to the player. That cutscene, the way that story plays out is presented, is designed as part of the design of the game. And cutscenes are typically linear media, little movies that are just literally embedded within the game. The play stops, and for a little while, you're just watching things happen on screen. Exactly like Marty said, like a movie, like something out of Lord of the Rings, with edits and cuts and camera angles and music, all of that. For the designer who is telling a story through the game, this offers a comfortable sense of narrative control, right? Like we have some sense of how to structure linear media, how to make a movie, and how to make a movie emotional and resonant, have it connect with people, have it mean something. And the player kind of takes their hands off the controller for this part, which sometimes, if it comes after an especially exciting moment, that can be a nice little break. But for the most part, generally speaking, the player doesn't want to take their hands off the controller, right? They're not watching a movie. They're playing a game. They want to be playing. They want to be active in their engagement. So how do you tell a story when the player is in control of where the camera is pointing? Well, there are some compromises. There are some strategies aside from cutscenes where you can try to do that. This is a moment from a game called Mass Effect Andromeda by the same studio that made Dragon Age. That's a little bit of an awkward solution, but this is used in a lot of different games, especially sort of open world or games that have sort of big set pieces with a lot of action. In this game, you can see from the screenshot, there's a little text element. There's a user interface element that appears in the middle of the screen that says, press the joystick to look. And that command, that sort of like instruction, press to look, is a little bit strange when you think about it. Like, you may have seen it in games that you've played, but it's a little bit of a weird thing. It's a request from the game to take control of your camera and take that control away from the player. And the player is sort of given the choice of, do you want to let the game move the camera so that it's pointed in the direction that the storyteller wants, that the designer wants? Or do you want to keep that control? And this is seen as a compromise between the designer as author having control over what the story is that they're telling and the player wanting to play the game, that tension between those two pieces. But it's a little bit of an awkward solution for that. On the other hand, giving up that control as a designer, giving the player the ability to do things like control the camera, has upsides, has advantages. There are things that we can do as game designers to exploit that. The designer can know where the player is looking and understand that the player has control over that and respond to it. This is a game called Lollipop Chainsaw from a number of years ago. It was not a big hit, but it was a character action game on the original Xbox. And it's a ridiculous sort of over-the-top zombie action game. But you play this character who is a cheerleader, and she appears in this very sort of sexualized cheerleading outfit with a very short skirt. And if the player who has control of the camera moves the camera into a position to try to look up the character's skirt, then and she'll play an animation. She'll actually sort of respond to that and try to, pull her skirt down to keep you from looking. And the game pops up an achievement, a sort of a meta information that is attached to your profile on all of the games that you play. You can see here sort of cheekily titled, "I swear I did it by mistake." That's acknowledging and sort of calling the player out for what they were doing, for their behavior, what they did with the control that they had over the cinematography of the game.
And so, yeah, and I love that, because not only is that achievement, like, you get it in the game, but then it's attached to your gamer profile forever, and that can be public. It's shared. So that is on your permanent record that you wanted to swing your camera up and be a creep. And it's the game that calls that out and sets that record. So, like, when the designer knows where you're looking, it can be a very powerful thing. So taking that and then taking the concept of, even when a player has control, we understand that most media has happened within a rectangular frame. And the shape of that rectangle has changed over time. But paintings, drawings, illustrations, computer screens, mobile screens, they all have been mostly in a frame. We're going to briefly touch on what is now an emerging field, which is still fully being developed, which is storytelling in full 360. And this is in taking into account AR and VR. And granted, there has been theater in the round. You can look at immersive theater pieces, which again, also like grapple with a lot of these things. But it is very hard to direct a player's attention when you can't specifically know they're going to be looking in a certain direction. All of our knowledge about composition, tone, color, lighting become exceedingly more difficult when it's not within a nice little rectangle and in fact in a sphere.
And that awkward Andromeda solution doesn't even work anymore, because there's no good way to sort of take control of the camera for a moment if you're in a VR headset.
No, you'll get someone real sick if you do that. So once again, it's bad at making people look, but it's excellent to know where people's looking. Especially in AR and VR, you have an even more precise idea and understanding of where they're looking. And you can play to that, and you can start to tell stories, not necessarily based on where you want them to look, but where they are looking. Click. There we go. So talking about looking. So we've talked about cutscenes, we've talked about dialogue, we've talked about words on the page, but obviously, there's way more to story than just words. Lots of games use the verb explore. And so using narrative or using space to tell narrative is super important in a lot of media. A set tells a scene, and this does as well. We ask, what can the player learn from examining their environment? And can you tell a story entirely through environmental design? This is a hidden object game where the entire job of the player is to hunt and look and explore a scene and find magical objects or whatever. This is as a quote I very much like from a GDC Game Developers Conference talk, and the link is there. And I think we will be happy to share these slides for anyone who wants them afterwards. So environmental storytelling relies on the player to associate disparate elements and interpret them into a meaningful whole. Much like a detective investigating the scene of a crime. So we look here, this is a screenshot from Portal 2. And in Portal 2, you find these hidden rooms kind of by accident or by stumbling into them, where we begin to learn and see the narrative of a previous person who was stuck in the same experimental chamber that you were. And you begin to learn that character's backstory as well as your own through these wall scribblings and like little hidden rooms. And by just simply looking, reading a little, seeing what's been drawn, you can start putting together the story beyond what's currently happening to your character. So this is a little game I like to play. So this is a screenshot from a game. I'm not going to say what the game is, but if anyone in the chat wants to tell me what has happened in this scene or like what is going on in this room, feel free. Like, who was here last? What were the actions happening here last? Does anyone want to volunteer? Yes, it looks like a very messy room. What room is it? Thank you, Martin, for jumping in the chat. The living room, absolutely. All right. What's the state of the room? It's messy. There was a party last night. Absolutely, there was definitely a party, and we know that from. It's messy and quiet. It looks like it's from a horror game. It is lit a little creepily. Pre-COVID era party, absolutely. The main character probably had too much to drink. And so we know it's a party. I think we are pulling in the idea of the pizza box that's completely empty. We're pulling the fact that there's 2 cans. Oh, it looks like your room. We see 2 cans kind of implies that maybe that there's a lot of drinking going on. One thing I always notice is that the coffee table is askew. And so is the lamp over in the corner. Someone's tilted the lampshade. And so that definitely gives a sense of like a party, something going on. And then what I really like is what's been made with the couch. Yes, a pillow fort. Thank you. Someone's built a pillow fort. And so, oh, excuse me, I'm going to have someone joining our talk. That's Bento. You can learn a lot about my environment from what just jumped up behind me. But in this scene, yes, there's a pillow fort, there's some pizza, there's table lamps askew. And so this is actually from a game called Gone Home. And you come home in a storm to kind of explore what has happened and what's going on with your younger sister, I believe. And so as you explore these rooms, you stumble on a scene where essentially a teenager's been hanging out. The disrespect for the furniture is there. The pillow fort is there. The lampshade on the side. The cans, which could be alcohol, but also could be soda. And then we learn a little bit about the family too. That's a nice Persian rug on the floor. The couch is big and expensive. The room's large. We know this is not a family that's, this seems like a well-off family. So we learn a lot of details. Yeah, it could even be like a small birthday party. We learn a lot of details just by this scene. And that's without any context about what the game is. So here's another game, slightly different vibe. Does anyone want to kind of quickly guess what's happening here or what has transpired here? Yeah, it's Fallout 4, busted. Absolutely, it's definitely Fallout 4. It's a bar, that's correct. The undead were having a party. Oh, coronavirus. Yes, they're definitely dead. Drinking until they died. Absolutely. So in the game Fallout 4, it's about a post-apocalyptic world. Nuclear apocalypse has happened, and we know this, and we see a lot of remnants of the world that was. And in this scene, we see 2 skeletons at a bar, and one's literally got his hand up as if he's still pouring a drink. And we know this is how these two gentlemen chose to go out when they knew the bombs were falling. Their heads being tilted to each other could have just happened in a blast, but it gives us a sense of their camaraderie, their friendship, and this is how they chose their moment. They're going to go out drinking. I like the uniform cap on the side, which tells us that at a certain point he took down his duties. He took off his cap, whatever that is. It looks like it could be a policeman's cap or some official uniform, but he took it off. He went off duty. He went out drinking with his friend. And so you might as well go out in style, Nicola. That's a perfect example of it. And it's in a tender emotional moment that we learn just through looking at this space. And that's, we do this in real life. I think Pompeii is probably the most famous example of understanding a world and a place and moments before a tragedy, simply by discovering what is left and like looking around an environment and learning from it. I think this is all of archaeology is this. And so it's in our nature, and it's very wise to give your player the ability to really start sensing the story. Those little details matter.
When we're talking about environmental narrative, when we're talking about sort of taking in a story from the stuff that's around, from the scene, from the room, it seems like the designer is giving up a lot of their ability to direct the player's attention. That sort of is key to how we traditionally tell stories. So how can you be sure that the player is gonna see all of those things, is gonna recognize all of these little clues that you all pulled out of these scenes? Well, game designers have a lot of ways to help players who may have missed environmental details, not to tell them with sort of embedded narrative what is happening, but help guide them towards finding those things and seeing them, seeing the things that are important in a particular scene or in the story overall. And I'm gonna give some examples of this using games from the Legend of Zelda series, one of my favorite series of games, where, this series, like a lot of other games, uses user interface, uses audio cues, uses non-player characters, all to help direct the player's attention, guide them towards important elements in a frame or story elements in the overall narrative. For example, there's a whole part of user interface that's called heads-up display. And when we talk about heads-up display, the HUD, we're referring to the things that are on the screen that are not elements of the world, but are elements of the picture that the game is presenting to the player, right? So not things that exist in the world of the character, but things that are sort of added on to that for the player's benefit, to call your attention to things that you might otherwise miss. This is a screenshot from Breath of the Wild, the most recent Zelda game, where one of the important elements of the game is finding and collecting useful things that are throughout the world that are either dropped by enemies or growing or just sort of placed around. And the game adds this sort of little sparkle effect that you can see here. And it's not just a static image, but it's a little animation. And sometimes it's accompanied by an audio cue, by a little shimmering sound that makes it easier to see where these objects are, so that as you're just sort of scanning around, as you're looking left and right a little bit, you're more likely to notice these important objects, some of which are important because they're useful, like weapons and things like that. But some of them are important for you to make progress in the game. This is again still Breath of the Wild, and you can see that the HUD, the heads-up display, contains a lot of information, not just about sort of the objects in the world, but overlaid on top of the world that you see in order to tell you things that you might need to know in the moment. And some of those are things like how much life you have or what weapon you're using. But in the bottom right-hand corner, there's this whole area that's devoted to giving you more information about your environment in order to compensate for the fact that as a player, you are not really there. You just have this sort of fairly narrow field of vision of what the world is. And so there's information about like the temperature and the weather and stuff like that. But more interesting for us right now is this circle mini map, right? This overhead view of the landscape that you're in with an indication of where you are and what direction you're facing, and also important sort of points of interest, things in the world, features of the world, either geographical or things like, you know, a shrine, a place where you'll find puzzles, or a house or something like that, get marked on this map so that you as a player, while you're sort of running through the world, you also have this sense of what are the things that are nearby. And by designing what those features look like in the mini-map, by giving them sort of interesting shapes or colors, or by marking them explicitly with little symbols, the designer can direct your attention towards them, can make you sort of pay attention to those elements that they want you to see. I mentioned audio cues. We're going to watch a short clip here from Ocarina of Time. This is the remaster of Ocarina of Time that involves a monster, an enemy that drops from the ceiling on top of, or to try to drop on top of the player character. It's called a wall master. And you'll notice, listen carefully, there's a lot going on in the audio, but you'll notice this whooshing sound that happens before it falls. And also a shadow on the floor that's sort of called out explicitly. But that whoosh, that audio cue, lets you know that something is happening out of frame, even though you're not looking at it. In fact, for this enemy, you can't look at it. Your control of the camera is limited, so you can't see it. But the game still indicates that it's there. It lets you know that something's happening. Did you hear that? Did you hear the sort of whoosh that second time before the enemy descended? As you play the game, you sort of learn to recognize that sound and know that that means there's something happening up above you. The Zelda games also use characters, non-player characters, to help direct the player towards the story and progression through the game that sort of leads to completion of the embedded narrative. So this is again a remake, but a remake of Link's Awakening that just came out on the Switch, where that character is this owl, and the owl shows up every once in a while to sort of tell you where you should be going next, what you should be doing. And you don't have to do it, or you don't have to do it right away. You can go do other stuff first. But the owl is there to sort of direct you towards, this is where the story is going to continue. Maybe the most famous example of this kind of character is Navi, the fairy from Ocarina of Time. This is a quote from a reviewer talking about the best video game wingmen ever, the best sort of companion characters. Navi does everything a good sidekick should do. She tells you how to work the game's controls, reminds you what to do next when you forget, gives you hints when you're stuck. So let's just see the sort of introduction of Navi. As you can see, Navi has the ability to do a lot of stuff to direct the player's attention through audio that's associated with the character, through the dialogue that's associated with the character. She's literally telling you what you should do next. The Great Deku Tree wants to see you. You should go see him. And lighting that is associated with the character as she moves around and as she does that sort of bouncing up and down, like that is wildly attractive. That pulls your attention. And if that's happening sort of slightly off screen, then you're going to turn and look, because that sound, that motion, the sort of ambient light all grabs your attention and sort of makes you look. And then Navi can sort of explain what you're looking at or tell you something important about what's happening or what's going to happen next.
So the other feature of Navi is she was considered extremely annoying. And so I've been watching the chat go by and talking about great examples of UI and audio and UI, and I saw Dark Souls come up. And so I think we love Dark Souls because it is minimal and it is brutal and it is mean. It's a mean game. But Dark Souls still does a lot of telegraphing, how you learn those boss fights, all those things. It's just very subtle. And it's a credit to the designers of Dark Souls that, one, they built something where every time you fail, you don't blame the game, you blame yourself. And that's because they've put in all those elements to help you, but they've trimmed them back to a very minimal state, but they are still there to help. One of the things I like about Dark Souls is that there's the player guidance from other players. You can write messages and leave them for other players. But I do want to kind of advocate for UI and advocate, yes, praise the sun, and advocate for Navi. And because I think there's an impulse as designers, and we see this a lot with our students and even in our own selves, where we want to show and not tell. I think it's a famous narrative conceit of like, show the action, don't tell it. But UI guidance, things like Navi, while they seem annoying, while they seem hand-holding, also empower the player to feel comfortable and strong in the world so that they can go out and explore the world that the designer creates. UI is at its best when it emboldens the player to become Link in this case. Because every day you're not running around with a sword, hacking down pots and chickens and monsters. You need the UI to help you learn the game and to become Link. And so a UI that seamlessly transitions you into the character of the game and helps you feel embodied in that world is the best type of UI. That doesn't mean there's no UI. That means it has to be structured and well designed to really help you explore. Sorry, I have a UI rant that I always have to do.
So we've talked around this idea of agency a whole bunch, but we're going to address it head on. Agency means that the player's choices and actions play a role in determining the outcome of the story, right? This is that sort of co-authorship, that collaboration. The side of it that is the player's side is called agency. And to think and talk about agency, we will talk about non-linear storytelling. Unlike traditional stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that outcome is sort of known and is pre-written. Non-linear storytelling refers to any time that the outcome can change, right? The story can be different depending on how it gets played in the case of a game. Or in the case of a choose your own adventure book. I don't know if you all are familiar with these. They were big in the 1970s and 80s and a little bit in the 90s. And if you're not aware of what these are books, paper-bound books, that are that tell a story, but the story is not told sort of traditionally from starting on page 1 and continuing until the end of the pages. Instead, when you start, you're given a passage of text that sort of introduces the scenario, and then you're given a choice. And the choice says, if you want to do one thing, then turn to such and such a page, turn to page 50. If you want to do another thing, turn to page 95. And when you do that, when you turn to the new page, the story continues along a different path, depending on your choice. Choose Your Own Adventure didn't invent this. There were sort of experimental novels doing this back to the 1930s. But this is in the late 70s and the 80s with Choose Your Own Adventure, this became sort of commercially accessible. And this is an example of a map of all of those choices in a Choose Your Own Adventure book. In this case, it's one called The Cave of Time. And you can see a couple of things from this. One is that there's a lot of separate pieces that are all kind of tied together, little scenes. And that, for example, you make a choice over on the left, you make a choice at the beginning of the game that takes you in 2 different directions and determines largely the set of things that can happen for the rest of the game, right? If you make that top choice, then you're dealing with a completely different tree than if you take the second choice and other things happen. By the way, all the things that are in red are places where the character dies. So there's a lot of that in the aesthetic of these old Choose Your Own Adventure novels, where you just sort of suddenly meet some kind of a gruesome end. We call this branching, right? Branching is a simple way to think about how agency, that is the player's authorship, the player's control, affects storytelling. When in a branching model, when you think about branching, when a player makes a choice, there are different possible outcomes that offer different subsequent choices. So a choice sort of creates a branch and 2 new possibilities, and then each of those possibilities will have their own branches, and those branches will sort of keep going. In fact, that's a problem, right? If every choice creates a branch like this, then the content in the game grows exponentially. And so that includes all of the embedded narrative, all of the pre-authored stuff that the designer has to come up with. And here in this top sort of tree, you've got an example of a content explosion where depending on the choice that the player makes at the beginning, there's an entirely different set of stories that can happen that have to be written by the designers and sort of decided and tested and played out. And in the case of modern games, that means that you're going to be designing characters and dialogue and voice acting and cut scenes and all kinds of things like that. It can be very expensive. So there's this concept of pruning, and pruning basically means that multiple branches that split off when the player makes a choice tie back together and come to sort of a common place. And that is presents the ability to balance a little bit the player's sense that their choices, they are making choices, and their choices result in different narrative outcomes, changes to the story, but the story doesn't just keep spreading. The story sort of can come back together, and there can be a manageable amount of different possibilities that the designer then has to worry about. Now, there is still getting this balance can be really hard and can be messy when you're talking about this model of branching narratives. And part of that is that you usually want there to be more choices than there are endings, or at least you want the player to feel like they're making a lot of different choices, but you don't want that sort of infinite branching where you have to come up with a different story for every possible choice that the player can make. And so you don't want too many sort of outcomes at the end, but you do want the player to feel like their choices determined the outcome, determine what ending they get. So how do you do that? There are multiple ways that you can do that, and some of them involve these very messy graphs like this, where you're mapping out overlapping possibilities of stories. But also, rather than a simple branching model, rather than creating explicit branches, you can have the player's choices affect the story indirectly. So for example, you can have the player's actions cause them to gain something, to gain a weapon or a skill or an item or information of some kind. And you can have optional parts of the game, side quests that the player can do but doesn't have to do, or secret objectives that they can fulfill maybe without even realizing it. And then change how the story branches, how the sort of the outcome of the story is determined based on what the player has or did. And what's important about this, what makes it sort of useful, is that the branches no longer have to be one-to-one. So for example, you could have lots of different weapons in the world, and the only thing you care about at the end is whether the player has a weapon or not. But there's lots of different ways that the player could go about getting a weapon that sort of cause that branch. And then the player feels like their choices mattered because what they did got them the weapon, and having the weapon changed the ending. Just as a little example to talk about world state models, I'm gonna sort of talk through this little mini segment of an imaginary game. So a world state model is basically this thing that I'm talking about, right? It is a data structure. It is the memory that the game has of what is going on in the game world. And a world state model describes all of the characteristics of the world that relate to all possible narrative branches and what state they're in, if they're true or not, or what their value is. So this is a very simple little mini example where our world state model consists of two values. The first one is, do you have the key? Yes or no? And it starts out as no, you don't have the key. And is the door open? Yes or no? And that also starts out as no, the door is not open. And so that's the world state model. That's what the game knows about the world, or is paying attention to about the world. And this is a game where you are escaping from a dungeon. Imagine it with me. You're escaping from a dungeon. You come to a locked cell, and there's a prisoner inside who asks you to let him out. And you have a choice now. You can try to open the door, or you can keep going. But if you try to open the door, the game is going to notice that you don't have the key. And so you can't open the door. The door doesn't budge. And there's not really anything to be gained down that story branch. So you're kind of forced to take the other branch and keep going. But now you have another choice. You can head directly for the exit, or you can investigate the guard's room. And if you head for the exit, then you get out of the dungeon, but the game knows that the prisoner is still back there. So there's an outcome where you escape, but the prisoner doesn't. If you investigate the guard room, then you find a key. And now the game will internally flip its understanding of the world. Do you have the key? Yes, you do. And now you could still head for the exit and get out, or you could go back to that locked cell. And now when you try to open it, because you have the key, that does something different. The story plays out differently. The prisoner, the door is opened, and that is something that the game also pays attention to. And this time when you head for the exit, now the game says, is the door open? Yes, it is. The prisoner escapes along with you. And that's a different outcome to the story. The idea behind this is that the world state model can be relatively simple. but it can still drive a lot of interesting and complex changes to how the story plays out. This is especially if that value, rather than just being a yes or a no, is something numerical, can be like a scale. This is another example from Fallout, the game with the skeletons drinking at a bar. And Fallout has a reputation system. And the reputation system is basically a value that's associated with your character in different locations, where depending on what you do, it will affect your reputation. It will push your reputation up, or it will push your reputation down. All kinds of different things, all kinds of different choices affect your reputation. Right? If you steal from somebody, then your reputation goes down. If you ignore somebody who is asking for help, then your reputation goes down. If you help somebody, then your reputation goes up. But there's lots of different people that you could help in different ways. So you as a player are making all kinds of different choices, and all of those different choices affect this one number. And then the game, when it presents you with a new scenario, when you meet a character for the first time, for example, it can reflect the value of that number, of your reputation, in how that character treats you, how they introduce themselves, whether they offer you an opportunity or whether they try to start a fight. Depends on what your reputation value is, sort of the sum of the actions that you've taken.
I'm gonna jump in here once again. The chat's popping, so I'm super excited about what people are calling out. But we're going to talk about one last example of world state models before we actually transition to a lot of what we've been talking about in chat. So once again, let's jog on back to Dragon Age Inquisition and look at this hot mess, this beautiful hot mess, which is the Dragon Age Tapestry. So Dragon Age Inquisition is the third game in the Dragon Age series, and they have come out with significant time gaps in between them. So the original was coming out on, oh gosh, the PlayStation 2, maybe? Don't quote me on that, but a while ago. And so if you play the first game, what your choices in the first game can affect your choices in the second game. And the choices in the second game, it can start to affect your choices in the third game. And so all these world state models need to know the information of your previous playthroughs. And unfortunately, the technology was so outmoded at that point that they had to build an online website where you could go in and pick each of your choices from the previous games, build your tapestry with all this lovely art, and then import it into Dragon Age Inquisition so that all the choices in your previous two games actually mattered. And this is fascinating in two ways. One, it calls out the choices that matter. Not every choice you make in Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 2, I guess. I think that's all it's called. Actually matter. Tapestry tells you exactly what matters and what doesn't matter and what it imports into the latest game. So it kind of calls out explicitly. And both Sean and I have both played this game, and this is my tapestry. I screenshot it, and Sean was quick to say that because mine doesn't look anything like that. It's two different things, and like it calls out how unique my playthrough is, and where BioWare was smart in creating this is that now I've got a beautiful piece of art to share and to show off and to, talk about my game to other people, which was very clever. All right, but I have noticed people in the chat calling out the fact that, I'm not into the cutscene thing. I don't want to play Call of Duty story mode. Who plays Call of Duty story mode? And so let's forget all about the designer for a hot second and talk about the player. We're going to talk about emergent narrative. And so this is what the stories are generated through you playing. Some elements of these have been created by the designer, but in a lot of these, the story themselves weren't planned. They're what you talk about when you play the game. So let's look at Breath of the Wild example. You have a quest. You've got to go fight a big scary monster to get to a certain location, but he's gonna kick your butt. So you have to go craft some armor, craft some things, but then you need to collect the materials for that armor and things. And while you're on your way to do that, all of a sudden you notice a cave. And so you decide to go ahead and start exploring it. That decision path was not made by the designer. Again, the designer can influence you with UI and text and all these other things, but the path you choose is your own. So what's great about that is you can get a sense of adventure. Your story is unique and it's to you. However, games are limited things, and sometimes they can be really annoying parts of emergent narrative. You can get stuck in conversation loops. You can have the same conversation with a character or an NPC, and you're like, we've already said this. You can get into dead end actions where you end up somewhere where you weren't supposed to be yet, and there's nothing you can do and you feel frustrated. You can get stuck. And then obviously the biggest one is dying repeatedly, not missing something and just starting over again and again and again. And those are all frustrating things, but if a designer acknowledges that and leans into it, they can do some really cool things with it. So this is the game Hades. It's a roguelike, which is a type of game that's very specific about, like, you know, procedurally generated dungeons and trying again and again and again. But this crafts its story entirely around that concept. We see Zagreus here, who is the son of Hades, and he is raring to get out of the underworld. He's immortal, so every time he fails to get out of the underworld, fails to get through this roguelike dungeon, he comes back to the start. Hades' entire narrative is built, and storyline is built around the fact that you are going to try and try and try and try, and you are going to fail and fail and fail and fail. It builds out narrative systems that when you come back, you are going to have different conversations. It understands the type of gameplay that's going on and builds structure to best suit and tell the story for the mechanics.
And this is called Emergent Narrative, right? Emergent Narrative, what's one of the things that's really cool about Emergent Narrative is that it doesn't actually require all of those traditional elements of drama that we've talked about and learned about, like characters and plot, things that traditionally drive drama forward. Emergent narrative can be driven by dynamic systems, either entirely or in part, in sort of combination with embedded narrative. The two can go together. But you get some games that are sort of outliers that are entirely emergent, where there aren't embedded narrative features. There aren't things like characters and plot. Something like Tetris, right? Tetris doesn't have the traditional elements of drama, but it is still dramatic, and it has an emergent narrative. And that emergent narrative actually follows the same kind of structural map that that other types of drama also follows. You know, the story of a game of Tetris is that you start off with you know, a big empty space that's easy to maneuver in, and the blocks are falling slowly, and you probably make some good moves and you score some points, and you get a Tetris here and there, and you make some rows disappear, and then over time, little mistakes start to pile up, and you have less room to operate in, and it's a little bit harder to maneuver the blocks, and the blocks are moving faster, and so at some point you kind of lose control of the whole thing, and it just out of control, spreads to the top, the blocks keep falling, and you lose the game, right? And that story, that sort of dramatic arc of the rising tension as your mistakes pile up, as the game sort of moves faster and faster, and this climax where you're trying to keep going and you lose control and everything falls apart, that maps to this sort of like what a traditional plot structure or dramatic structure should look like, even though the thing that drives that is just the underlying rules that make the blocks fall and determine sort of what causes what to happen, and the fact that they speed up over time, and the sort of tension between the amount of space that you have and your ability to move the blocks, those kinds of things.
So we haven't talked at all about multiplayer. And so the fact that like some of the best encounters, some of the best stories we tell about games are not what the game was trying to get us to do, but how we interacted with each other. And if you're smart, how the designers facilitated that. So emergent, so the more social context you have, the more gameplay you have between players, you can actually really have very complex and exciting stories. And that's, I think, a lot of the times the stories we tell about when we tell our, you know, our war stories for games.
I do want to like really point out though that these social, the stories that come out of these social games aren't pre-authored. Like nobody sort of sat down and wrote the games so that you would have that exact experience, but they were intended. It's not that they had nothing to do with what the designers wanted you to get out of the game. The game was created in this emergent way to drive that kind of story.
Yeah, and actually, I want to call it in the chat Stefan's comment about the lore sometimes being outside of the game, like in League of Legends or in Overwatch, where they build these cinematics that sit outside separately of the game that tell you a bit that you can enjoy, but that the gameplay is actually very just, you know, action oriented. I want to ask who plays Among Us, if anyone plays Among Us here. Because this is an example of an like incredible social generator game. Yeah, there we go. So basically in Among Us, you are trying to figure out who the imposters are, and like that accusation, and the way the designers have built it, you don't talk except for certain set periods, and how you observe those, how those tasks are all doing are essentially the playing field. But the real drama, the real story is what the actions the players take with each other to lie and deceive and murder and falsely accuse each other while all that goes down. Yes, absolutely. So a lot of social deduction games really play with these elements and tell very dramatic stories. And then once again, we're always focused on how we can make sure that these stories are being told and that the designers are building and designing for that structure. And I think one of the good examples of how a multiplayer game highlights these emergent narratives is in Overwatch's play of the game. Earning the play of the game when you are, you know, battling, the two teams are fighting, and you know, your character gets this like, you know, 4-shot kill streak before going down, and you feel amazing. And then the game goes around and says, hey, that was amazing. It acknowledges the stories you're going to be telling anyways, but features them and like lets your friends see them as well. It's a great way to call out player action. Yeah, sorry, I'm just reading the chat, but yeah. And then I think that building that into your systems where you can see and observe player action helps enhance the stories we tell each other. So there's another type of game. So we talk about multiplayer in that world and the stories we, you know, create between each other. But then there's also sandbox games. And so these essentially leverage emergent storytelling through play. They're about providing an extremely complex interactions with a world that allow players to kind of like set their own goals and start playing creatively. So I think obviously the big one we think about is Minecraft. It doesn't essentially have goals or other than survive if you're even playing in survival mode, but Minecraft can even remove the survival aspects. And it's essentially gives you the tools to build your goals and set your objectives for yourself as opposed to the game telling you explicitly. So this is King's Landing from the Game of Thrones books and TV show built in Minecraft. And there's no achievement for building King's Landing in Minecraft, but there is just the impetus of it was there. Like I wanted to do it. It was there because it was there is the quote for George Malroy, who was one of the first people to summit Everest. Like, why did you do it? Well, because it was there, because I wanted to. And a well-crafted system gives players the ability to realize that kind of like goal or ambition. This is another example. I decided I wanted a skull mountain in Minecraft. Like, you know, I didn't know I wanted it until I saw the mountain and it was there. And I was like, absolutely, I'm going to be building a skull in that mountain. I want a fortress there. So self-directed action makes the emergent stories more memorable. Like, obviously, I screenshotted this. I saved this because to me, like, that was something I entirely came up with on my own. And Minecraft assisted me in doing that. But like, to me, the setting of a goal and the ability to execute it is a very empowering feeling that can make players feel, you know, unique in the world. Another example of this is The Sims. And I think The Sims is a great example because you can dismiss it as just playing house or playing with dolls, but it's not. There's so much complexity in The Sims that there's all these little reactions and feedback and loops that when you set up a scenario, the game is essentially playing with you. All the unpredictable things that happen, all those randomized chances, all those little different interaction points that have been built out, so that when you put the pieces together, you're essentially telling the story with the game. It's letting the game saying, here's how it could be, here's a million ways it could go. And as you put those pieces together, you begin telling the story with them. For example, like we've got someone who, I don't think the game designers intended for you to date the Grim Reaper, but they didn't say that you couldn't date the Grim Reaper in The Sims. And so combining all the, how the Sims behave with your player's goals of, I'm going to date the Grim Reaper, creates this kind of like wild and craziness that is like continually generates stories depending on the investment of both the game and the player.
So procedural storytelling describes the way that games can tell stories through carefully constructed dynamic systems, right? Games like Tetris, games like The Sims, these are procedural, not in the sense that like Marcy talked about, roguelites have procedural level generation. That is a type of procedurality, but procedural storytelling is also something that we see in games. When games are constructed around the conceit of creating emergent narratives based on the actions that the player take, but crafting what stories can come out of that by the way that they design all of the elements of the system that the player is interacting with. So in procedural storytelling, the designer creates the rules, and those rules then result in a particular emergent experience. And this is relevant to us when we're talking about games for good, especially because procedural storytelling is tightly related to how games do things that make them meaningful. That make people sort of take meaning out of them. For example, reflecting real world systems or making statements or commentary about those systems, spreading awareness or spreading knowledge about a particular topic, or teaching skills, teaching practical skills through gameplay. To go back to thinking, passive versus active engagement, thinking about traditional media and film criticism and the sort of, the viewer experience for films. We can find meaning in a film by looking at traditional story elements, like, for example, what the protagonist wants and what obstacles they face and whether and how they succeed. From those sorts of elements, we come to an understanding of what this film is about and what it means and what it is saying about the world. And we can find all of that stuff in games too, in the embedded narrative elements of games, in their cutscenes, in their dialogue, in the descriptions of lore of things, and in the, in the character videos that that are produced by Riot or BioWare or Blizzard. But we can also find meaning in the game's mechanics and in its feedback. So mechanics, for our purposes right now, for today, mechanics basically are, what does the game allow you to do? What does it permit? What does it allow? And then the feedback is, what does the game reward you for doing? What does it sort of encourage you to do or incentivize?
All right, so we are about to wrap this up, but we're going to do one last case study on a game. So this is a game, Up the River. It is for children, probably 6 and up. It's a board game, and it's a competitive game where you are have a bunch of people who have 3 boats each, and they're trying to race them up a river. Basically, your goal in the game is to take your boat and tie it up at one of the little docks you see on that board right there. So if you tie it up at dock 12, you get 12 points. If you tie it up at dock 4, you get 4 points. And if you tied your third boat up at dock 1, you would get 17 points total, because it would be, yes,
Right.
is that right? Yes.
That sounds right.
Yeah, no one check. So that's it. You roll,
But it's a race, right? So the first person to get there gets the 12 points.
So here's the trick, though. So the board itself with the river is built into these little strips. And on your turn, you can move only one of your boats. After every player who's been playing takes a turn, the whole board shifts and the river pushes all the boats backwards. So you grab that bottom tile and you bring it up to the top and everything slides down one. If your boat is on the last tile when the waterfall moves after everyone has taken its turn, that boat is lost, it is sunk, it is gone. And so you roll a 6-sided dice and you can move your boat. And that's about it. You can choose which boat you move depending on where they are, but that's about it. And basically,
That's the mechanic, right? Like what can the player do? The mechanic in the game is you can choose which boat you want to move. And that's basically it. So then the other part is the feedback, right? What does the game reward you for doing? And to answer that question, we have to think about the game's dynamic systems and do a little math, because it seems on the face of it that you're going to take your turn, you're going to roll your die, you're going to choose a boat and move it forward, and you're racing. You're going to try to sort of roll higher numbers than everybody else. But if we think about the systems involved, we can actually find a deeper meaning to it. So the first thing that we need to think about is the die, and we need to talk about sort of a little bit of statistics. Sorry. What is the expected value when you roll a die? On a 6-sided die, there's obviously a lot of things that you can roll. You can roll a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or 4 or 5. In Up the River, actually, because of the rules of the game and the way the dice work, you can't actually roll a 6. So you really are rolling more of a 5-sided die. But still, there's a lot of variability. The difference between rolling a 1 and rolling a 5 is a big difference, right? But we can say that, over a lot of rolls, playing a lot of turns of a game, and especially playing multiple games, sometimes you're going to roll a 1, sometimes you're going to roll a 5, but on average, you're going to roll a 3. You're going to roll something close to a 3 most of the time. So our expected value for your die is 3 tiles. You're going to move your boat forward 3 tiles every round. Not every round, but that's sort of how we can think about it. But remember, you've got 3 boats, right? So actually, you can move each boat forward 3 tiles on your turn, but it's going to take you 3 turns to move all of your boats forward, at which point you will have moved all of your boats forward 3 tiles each. But remember what Marcy was talking about with the river and the waterfall. Every round after every player takes a turn, the whole board moves backwards. The river sort of pushes all of the boats back 1 tile. So every turn, all of your boats move backwards by 1. And over the course of 3 turns, all of your boats are going to move forward 3 tiles, and all of your boats are going to move back 3 tiles. So actually, your boats don't make a lot of progress. Now, there's variability here, right? Because you're rolling a die, and sometimes you're going to roll a 1, sometimes you're going to roll a 5. But in general, as you keep rolling, you kind of stay where you are. And there's this emergent story that comes out of every game of Up the River, especially every game that new players play. At first, everybody's kind of stuck. There's a lot of excitement. You're going to win this race. Everybody's rooting for their own boats. Several turns go by and everybody kind of is in the same place. They're not making a lot of headway. But before too long, someone suffers a string of bad rolls, gets sort of a bunch of 1s or something like that. And one of their boats goes over the waterfall and disappears. And it's sort of tragic. Everybody's like, oh man, that player is in trouble. But then all of a sudden, that player starts moving faster than their opponents. And this happens because now they've only got 2 boats to divide their rolls up between. And every 2 turns, they move both of those boats forward 3 spaces, and the river moves them back only 2. So now that player's starting to make progress and make progress faster than their opponents. And often that player, whoever is the first person to lose a boat, ends up winning the game because they take the top 2 positions at the end. This, again, we see the dramatic arc of this game conforms to the dramatic arc of all kinds of drama, right? Our standardized structure for drama, that it has this rising movement. It's got this climax where sort of one player takes off and wins the game. And that doesn't emerge from the authored elements, from sort of the fact that this is a boat race on a river, or that there are ships or things like that. This emerges from the way that all of the systems work together to tell the same story over and over again. Of course, if you know this, if you've played the game a bunch of times, or if you think through all of the implications of your actions, your choices, it changes the way that you play the game. And you might actually not move all 3 of your boats evenly because you know that you're not going to make progress that way.
So this is a game for children. And what does this teach children? Like, seriously. It's dark. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices to make progress. Like if something's dragging you down, leave it behind. You can't save everyone. Don't trust boats. Yes. But it's kind of a heady thing for a very simple, cute children's game. Like at the end of the day, the lessons it teaches, the mechanics it uses, impart a maybe useful but very dark moral. Learn to fail to be successful is actually a much more optimistic take on it, Daniel. Thank you. But true. And so like your mechanics have implicit messages and story structure in them. So how you use them and how you implement them is very important.
We're going to talk more about these topics, about mechanics specifically, and about games for good next week when we dive into how to design characters and levels for games. But we're going to wrap up now. Just to recap, we talked about embedded narrative, and embedded narrative in games works like traditional storytelling, like plays and film and novels and drama in general. But players are active participants in games, and that limits the authorial control that designers can exert over the story. Agency means that stories can branch, and you can structure this in all kinds of ways and in sophisticated ways according to some kind of a world state model. But you can't always predict the emergent narratives of a game in play. You don't know what is going to be the specific experience of every player who plays your game. However, you can use dynamic systems and design dynamic systems and use procedural storytelling to generate emergent stories that have meaning, that aren't just random, but are directed and have this similar shapes and teach lessons or have some sort of meaning associated with them. And that's the end of our presentation. I think Marcy and I would love to take questions from the audience. I think I can do that, yeah.
Wow, thank you. It was really interesting for me at least, but let's wait and see what are the reactions from the audience. Well, only one so far. I don't know that. Anyway, before we start and dive into the questions, I have to mention 2 things. First, it was very interesting to follow the chat. it was like a totally parallel presentation and discussing going out there. So maybe we can go back and comment on some of the things that are said, although I think that we mentioned all of those. And then I have a favor to ask. Can you please send me the presentation so I can share it with the students, okay?
Absolutely, we'd be happy to.
Okay, and well, any questions from for our distinguished lecturers, guys? Do you have any? Well, only a few comments.
We know it's late there, so we
Yes.
understand. It's like 11:30 where we are a.m., but we know it's late.
Oh, that's why I'm so energized. Okay.
We appreciate. I just got a question from Nicole. When you design a game, do you prefer the game to play out, ooh, steps going too fast, in the style of Mass Effect, or do you prefer to make it like an Uncharted? So this is a great question, because Uncharted actually really makes a point of having essentially all their cutscenes playable. And so the action in a lot of these scenes, when you're falling out of an airplane, or if you're like driving through a rough terrain, they really try to make sure that the player is continuously in the action. I think, me personally, like if you sat me down and said, Mark, do you want to play Uncharted? Do you want to play Mass Effect? I'm going to take Mass Effect every time. I enjoy the moments where I can let the controller go. I love heavy story structure. I will sit and read a book in Skyrim. That is my type of gameplay. I am very familiar and very aware that is not everyone's type of gameplay. Most people are like, skip. I'm not talking to everyone. I'm someone who talks to everyone in the village, and other players do not want to go. They want to go. They want to be in the heart of the action. They don't want to lose the moment. They have chosen active media. They've chosen to lean forward in this experience. And when you take away that agency or control, it leaves a lot of players frustrated. So I say it is a personal call. I think that the game world is big enough for both, but if games can structure, I think Mass Effect is well suited to cater to players who do not want to lean back as much as I do sometimes. Sean, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think there's another dimension. I think that's absolutely right. There's another dimension as well where, the story of Uncharted doesn't really change depending on who's playing or how you play it. Whereas something like Mass Effect or Dragon Age, your tapestry ends up looking a lot different than mine because you made different choices and they led to different outcomes. The ending of an Uncharted game is always pretty much the same. And it's tough for me to say which do you prefer. They're very different in a lot of ways. I don't actually play the Uncharted games that much, but I really like the modern Tomb Raider games, which are basically the same thing. And those are similarly very, very linear story. All of the cutscenes are the same, no matter sort of what you do in between them. And it leads to an ending. It's very cinematic. It feels like playing through a movie in a lot of ways. But I also like games that have an emergent story and games that have sort of procedural elements. Somebody asked, what's your favorite game? And as much as I like the BioWare games and Mass Effect and that kind of stuff, my favorite games are more sort of strategy games like XCOM or Civilization. And what I really like about those and the stories that those games tell, like I was talking about with Tetris and like we were talking about with Up the River, the systems in XCOM are designed so that the same kinds of stories get told over and over and over again. But actually playing through them, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of drama to sort of what is going to happen next and what's going to be the outcome. So I really enjoy that.
I will answer quickly. The next lecture is going to be different. Again, like as Sean mentioned earlier, we're going to be focusing on character design and level design, which are very broad topics. So we're going to be with a storytelling focus on them.
And we'll talk a little bit about the games that Marty and I have made in that context as well.
And then we have a kind of a thing about going on a debate about going on about Among Us. And I think I think the comments actually responding to Stefan's question about Among Us are very like it is a social game, and I think the fact that Among Us rose in popularity as quarantine happened, it's a way to like it's the same. It's Among Us is not very different than the social game Mafia or Werewolf.
Right.
And it's about reading social cues because we can't be in person to read social cues to discover who's the werewolf or who's the Mafia hit boss. Among Us has these tasks, and I think it is because it is a low impact, like it is something that it's easy to pick up and is incredibly social when people are craving social connection and to discuss a bit of drama that has no real consequences, that made it so popular right now. That would be my
yeah opinion. I mean, Among Us is a great game and is a really well designed game, and specifically solves some of those problems, Marcy, that you're calling out about playing social deduction games and secret identity games over the internet. I think it solves some of those problems well, but I think it also it caught its moment at the right time, and it's not necessarily that it is the objectively best game that made it the most popular game in an arena. It's the fact that it's so accessible. It's so easy to pick up and play for all sorts of different people on all sorts of different platforms. It streams really well. It's fun to watch somebody play it on like Twitch, and that helps make it more popular because people who have never played it before will see somebody else playing it and think that looks fun. So I think there's a lot that goes into sort of what makes a game successful, that is not just is the game good, although I think that a game has to be pretty good in order to achieve that kind of success.
We got, how do you decide which choices are given to the player in choice-driven games?
Oh. So I think we can talk more about that next week, especially if there's some interest in it. I think we can gear some of our talk towards that, but a lot of that comes down to this sort of question of, what do you want your game to say? What do you want it to mean? What sorts of message do you want players to take away from it? And that idea of, there is a moral at the heart of even a game like Up the River, even a game that is made for children and for sort of parents to keep their kids busy, that expresses something, right? That sort of teaches a lesson. And playing the game, you get a sense as a player of a point of view or a worldview or a statement that this game is making. And I think that choices are a really powerful way that game designers have to craft that kind of a message, in the same way that a director is going to choose a camera angle that is going to show a particular scene exactly the way that they want it to be shown, and that camera angle helps to say something. I think deciding what choices you give to the player versus what things the player's not allowed to have input on, have agency over, that really says something, that sort of makes a statement. And if you are paying attention to that and you're crafting that well, then that is a big part of how you say something with your game.
Yeah. I dropped a link to some of the games together, and some that Chanam's just made. This is his itch page, but I make him do a lot of hosting. I will add an aspect that these games are a little out there. They're definitely not your traditional like shoot 'em up games. They're very narrative driven. Right. And so I'll warn you.
Marcy and I are academics, so we are making weird little games.
But in terms of games that inspired us to be game designers, I think we might, I don't know how much time we have. I will, the games I loved growing up, I did not know I could be a game designer on them. Like that was never seemed like a career path for me. I was told I was not good at math, and then I just gave up entirely. But I always loved So I was inspired games like Final Fantasy VII in my childhood, which I think absolutely dates how old I am. But in terms of games that I think that inspired me, I'm going to go ahead and say, like, I really, the Dragon Age series was one of the first times where I really felt connected to the choices I had made as a character. And I felt connected to the non-player characters. And so to me, that was super inspiring. And then what really made me love games and really want to make a lot of games is I enjoy a lot of mobile games and a lot of narrative heavy mobile games. And I like the tend and befriend, like a quick play session in a game. So I'm a proud mobile gamer, which is, I think, a little embarrassing to some people, but I advocate for that as a new platform and a new medium.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with Legend of Zelda games on the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo. Also BioWare. So Marcy talked about Dragon Age. For me, it was Knights of the Old Republic was really a turning point for me, and sort of realizing that games could tell stories that were powerful in the way that I'd seen movies that sort of really affected me. I think Knights of the Old Republic is probably the first game that did that. But then also like Katamari Damacy or Portal were big for me. And then I got into like weird academic indie games and text-based games like parser games or weird little experimental games that sort of drove me towards wanting to be a part of that community and make those kinds of games.
So I believe we have a couple comments about how to like further develop characters and story worlds and like lore, and we'll definitely get into that next week. So yep. I don't want to, but Jordan's, your comment about what if the player exploits something that you didn't intend? Do you patch it out even if it's harmless? I love a good game-breaking bug or I love that sort of stuff. So I say it's not a bug, it's a feature. Is definitely I think there's a YouTube series about developers watching speedrunners play their game. And it's not just us. I think only the grumpiest of developers don't marvel at how a player can find the weird bug aspect, little bits and things that can cause a speed run to be really like honestly tell its own story. Like speed running is its own type of thing. And honestly, a lot of game communities or game designers build working with a speedrunner community in mind. The Hades developers absolutely did certain things so that like people, they know when they know that players are going to play their game a certain way that is not necessarily the traditional way they intended it, they still take that into account and start like thinking about how and what those features are and what they want to take out, but also what they want to leave in. And there was a question about music or dialogue. It's so game dependent, like whether it's better to have like, it just really depends on the game. Like one game with it sounds great, another game without it, like if it's a horror game or it's Dead Space and they're building the tension and it's just like, breathing. I think there's room and space for a lot of things in games. And that's what's so great is that there's such a wide variety. And what suits someone may not suit another person, but that's because games are so big and so welcoming that there's a lot of room for development and different types of play and different types of entertainment. Sean, do you see any other questions?
There's a question about like, how do you make a game more popular? And I think that's a huge topic that we're not going to be able to address adequately. Like there's a ton to answer there. I teach a whole course on that is still just the basics. But I think that it's not just a matter of how good the game is. I think there's a lot that goes into what makes a game popular, and in order to increase the visibility of your game, you have to think about not just the game itself and the player, but also the audience as a whole and the market. And also the truth is that like the way that games as an industry work is capitalist, and it is hard to gain visibility. It's hard to gain popularity starting from nothing. You have to have something that you can leverage, some kind of an investment. Doesn't have to be money necessarily. In fact, today it can be really expensive to buy things that are free, like influence on the internet, or a popular Twitch stream, or an in with a community around a gaming topic on, you know, an internet forum or a Discord channel or something like that. But if you don't have those, if you don't have sort of some kind of leverage, it's very hard for anybody to find your game, no matter how much you want them to, and no matter how good it is.
So I think one of the better ways to think about it, so that's kind of like a, but there are indie communities all over the world. There are indie, and there are people specifically looking at small development teams, small things, and so the ability to, you know, submit your games to festivals, to show it, to build a community of your own, of like people who like your work, or, you know, you share it. Like, honestly, the best thing to do to get your games, if you do not have the money and you do not have the resources, the best thing you can do is start to build a community around it and promote each other's work.
Yep.
You know, Sean and I have been lucky to show a lot of our games in different avenues and different venues, because we were like, okay, we're going to submit it to this talk, we're going to submit it to this festival, and then people have gone and asked us, can you show this game here, can you show this game there? And so I encourage you, like, when you are thinking like, how can I make something so small ever get noticed? Like, don't hide your ideas. Like, think about what makes them unique and like that will stand out in the market, and then make as small and as slim of prototype as you can. Like, try to get at the heart of what drives you to make and create. Take that prototype, take those things, and then start sharing it and showing it and being excited about it, and building a community of people who are like-minded creators who want to like share and showcase that work, because publishers, people are always also looking for new content. So, you know, not everything will be a success, but the best thing you can do is not try to work on something in silence till it's perfect, but like build a community and share your work.
Yep.
Whew. All right. And then I'm going to Teodora's question of, I hope I'm saying your Teodora's. I'm so happy I'm saying your names right. During design and development, can you predict all the things players will do in the game, or maybe just most of them? Playtesting.
Yeah. So we teach.
No, you'll never be able to predict everything players do, because players
that's true.
Players are wild.
You will never be able to predict everything that a player will do. We teach a methodology at USC that relies on playtesting a lot. That's really sort of based in the idea of playtesting and iteration, where you produce sort of a version of your game and you put it in front of players and you see what they do with it, and then you use that to sort of continue developing the game, right? You don't just show it to people when it's done. But I think that there's also a part of this question that gets at, like, how much emergent narrative do you want there to be in your game? How much variability do you want there to be between one person playing it and another? Because you can lock down a lot of the player's choices. If you have, you know, if you're producing a choose your own adventure book, or the digital equivalent of that, then there's not a lot that players can do that you can't predict, right? You don't know how every story is going to play out, but you're pretty tightly controlling what options they have. As you release that control, you get more emergent narratives, which can be really compelling to players. Players really respond to, this is a thing that happened to me, or that I did that nobody else saw, or nobody else did. Nobody else had quite the same story. But at the same time, that means that you're not going to be able to predict all of those different stories, all of the different things that players do, and the things that happen to them. And so finding a balance where you can control it enough that you can sort of maintain the quality of the game experience, right? Where you have enough control over it that you know it's going to be good, no matter what happens, but allowing the player to do all kinds of different things. That depends on how much emergence you want there to be, how much you want the player to be able to go in and mess around with stuff.
Absolutely. I think I see 2 more questions, and I think maybe we want to call it. All right. So we've got, when developing games, can devs foresee the future nostalgia potential, or is that just pure luck of the draw? I think luck of the draw.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, because nostalgia, the thing about nostalgia is that it's so much about what was popular in a moment years ago, right? So even if you can make a game that is a hit game, it's really hard to predict that like it will reach so many people and be so memorable to them that in 20 years they're going to look back on their youth, whatever that sort of means, and have that be a distinct feature that they remember, that they recall. I think it's easier to look at trends and say that, you know, right now, I think we're getting into like a PS1 era of nostalgia. And if you go back and look at all of the games that released on the PlayStation 1 and what they had in common, the kind of not just, the visual aesthetic, like what did they all look like, but also what kinds of mechanics did they have? What kinds of things did they allow you to do? What were they about? I think that those kinds of broad trends can tell you more about what nostalgia looks like and where it's going, than trying to make a game that drives that.
I will say though, like, you know, Final Fantasy VIII, fans of Final Fantasy VIII are a lot sadder than fans of Final Fantasy VII, and that is, I don't want to say that's luck, because obviously Final Fantasy VII is better, but but it is in a certain way, like what games hit, what games stick in the cultural consciousness are, right. And then I think their last question from Nicola is, when writing stories for characters, do you prefer to form the story how you see fit, or do you model the story around a character's appearance / vocal delivery from the potential voice actors, actresses, parentheses, Troy Baker? So if you are so lucky to have an extremely talented voice actor working for you, or, you know, mocap person, obviously, you're going to build towards that. Most designers do not have that luxury. We've been lucky enough to work with a Screen Actors Guild voice actress, Sarah Amala, who I just happened to play D&D with. So we got here, if you look on the itch.io page we linked, you'll see a game called the Klaxo Radio Hour, which is an entirely audio-based game that was originally housed in an actual radio, where we had essentially a famous voice actress in our lead role. And so obviously we were conscious of that, but even then, like, she read the part for the role first. So it's most of the time you find an actor who will suit your needs as opposed to the other way around. But it's absolutely possible to design if you know someone isn't attached to your project. And yeah, Sarah, you can find her work in what is it? What is the latest BioWare game that was not Mass Effect, but
Anthem.
Yeah, she's the lead female voice for Anthem. And a whole bunch of other stuff. So like, even when you have like a professional voice actor or actress, generally you tell them what to do, not the other way around, but it can go either way.
Well, there's just one last question from Stefan. Maybe we should address that as well.
There will always be those players who want to sabotage the game, and because that's what they do and it's intentional. So how do you deal with those players that make false claims about the game, ruin the games for other players? Games can lose a reputation for an image for very easy of those toxic players. How do you deal with that? That's an excellent question. I'm gonna leave Sean to answer now.
Thanks, Marty. I don't know that I have a good answer for it. I think this is, quite frankly, sort of a question that is defining the age that we're in right now. And I'm gonna be very interested in 20 years to look back on this specific question with a little bit of hindsight, because I think we're in a moment right now where there is something out of control about how games are talked about online, and so much of the way that we promote games, like that online discussion is tied into the industry, the sort of the commercialism of games itself, and that the way that they are intertwined creates this thing that you're identifying, where there's a lot dependent on potentially a few bad actors who can go into the Steam comments and tank a game's score and make it harder for other people to find it, even if that game is really a very good game or an interesting game that some people would like, that's maybe not for everybody. And that happens a fair bit. And I don't have an answer for that. I think that one thing to sort of be aware of when you are making games that are meant to be released publicly and especially commercially is that community management is a huge part of that right now. It's a huge part of not just the sort of like service of a game, the support for a game, but also the marketing for that game and the sort of like building of a community goodwill. I mean, I think that there's a part of me that believes that there's nothing you can do about some of this stuff, that you know, the sabotage, as you describe it, or toxic players, that is something that that you don't have a lot of control over. And so the best way that you can combat it is to build communities in a grassroots kind of way, in an organic way, and not necessarily because you can't rely or aren't necessarily able to rely on your Steam rating or your Rotten Tomatoes score or whatever. You might have to rely on a community of players that you have helped to nurture, who understand what your game is about, and your perspective in building it, and support what you're trying to do. And that's not necessarily easy, and it, you know, exposes, I think, some problems that exist on these platforms where Steam wants to be able to present a game score that is, or a rating that is like objective, and have that be consistent across all games, and it's not, and it kind of can't be, and there's not an acknowledgement of that necessarily. But I think you can build an audience for yourself that is that's not necessarily like the Steam audience. It's people who you've made a connection with and you've reached through your games or your other things that you have produced or said or communicated, who can be supportive.
And the last thing I'll add on to that before we wrap up is, like, at the end of the day, I think that a lot of this is growing pains. And like, you know, we could look at the discourse on Marvel versus DC, or what we think of the new Star Wars movies. And we could also highlight that those are contentious issues. Let's leave that at that. But that the fact is, like, someone watching a movie, that passive engagement, they can have their discourses a lot of places, but they can't, generally in the movie theater, there aren't people throwing punches and screaming at each other. It's a passive thing. You watch it and then you go to Twitter, or you go to this forum, or you go here, you go to Reddit, and you have your discussions about it, and you have your big debates, and then you send Ryan Johnson some really mean tweets if you're really worked up about it. But in a game, because especially a multiplayer game, those engagements can also happen in the game. So there's two different types of things. There's community management. There's a building a base and a group of people who are interested in your type of gameplay that is healthy, that like has an active people working out trying to keep the environment healthy and not toxic, and which is outside of the game, and the controls you build inside the game, how many safety measures you build inside the game, whether you can boot people, whether there's voice chat even allowed, whether players are anonymous or not, all that is controlled in the game. And so when you're thinking about these two parts, you have to like handle the internet as a whole as it is today, which is something that all media is sorting out and is part of our cultural progression at this moment. But you control what goes on inside your game. And so those safety precautions, those things you want to do inside your game, that's how you can build that. And again, the top minds are working on this. Blizzard and all of those other companies are paying lots of money because they know they have a problem. So Sean and I can, give our best guess, but I think this is something we're currently struggling with as a medium. I will put out a hopeful message on this to kind of maybe wrap us up with, is that a lot of this is growing pains, and games is growing fast. First of all, games, interactive media makes more money and is a bigger industry than movies, television, film, and music combined. And it has exploded, and we are still learning, but we are not as established as film or television or any of those things, but we definitely are bigger and a larger presence, and we are more actively working on solving those problems. In the 80s, video games were for boys, up to male to 24. That was it. That's where it was marketed. That's where it was going. And now everyone plays games. Your mom's got, her mobile games. My grandpa, my parents have an Oculus. Like it is widespread. Everyone plays different types of games. And I think we can talk about gatekeeping in the community, but like there's this fear that, I'll lose what's important to me. I won't be able to play my Dead or Alive beach volleyball anymore if, someone's playing Farmville. And that's simply not the case. Games is wider and games is expanding and it's reaching more people. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to lose the games you love, just that there's more money and interest and people playing and flowing into the industry as a whole, which means more innovation, which means more like unique types of stories, and just means more accessibility for everybody. Gatekeeping is a fear of losing what is special. But at the end of the day, if we accept that it is a wide field, that no one's going to come for what you love as long as you just let the doors open, and then people are going to go and create and build the things that they love. I think that is like our end goal. Like that is what we should be dreaming for and working for when we create games. Wow,
what a nice way to wrap it out. And well, thank you for the interesting discussions. And I think that we can continue this next week. I can wait to see what you have to tell us about developing different levels and creating things that are both fun and have some kind of social impact, educational, for example, and so on. And so just for the end, I would like to see some kind of reaction. So I would ask audience to use some kind of this reaction tool that they all have and try to judge the presentation and the discussion we had so far. So please.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Well, we're excited about next week too, and we'll see you. And thank you for staying up. I know it's late. It's hard to be on Zoom all day. We really appreciate you coming and listening to us.
Yes.
Wow. Thank you for being with us. And looking forward for next week then.
Thank you, guys. All the best.
All right.
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye. See you in 1 week.